Now, has the United States entered a new Cold War with China? The answer, according to our next guest, is not a simple one. But the question highlights the changing world order and the fluctuating tensions between the two superpowers. As President Trump tours Asia, the world watches Washington confront a shift where autocracies form alliances and strengthen their influence without America's involvement. The former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, joins Walter Isaacson now to discuss his latest book, exploring this power struggle.
Thank you, Christian and Ambassador Michael McFaul. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your new book, Autocrats versus Democrats. It's a great book, but somehow the title now, I'm wondering, are we blurring the distinction between the two? I mean, what do you mean by the Democrats, and to what extent does that apply to Western nations, even the United States?
Well, Walter, I've been working on this book for many years. I wrote most of it, 99% of it, before our last presidential election. And most certainly since President Trump won again and came back to office, he is blurring those lines in two different ways. One, he doesn't frame the world like I do between autocrats and Democrats, right? He sees strong leaders and weak leaders, irrespective of if they're democratically elected or not. And I just think that's imprudent for American foreign policy going forward. And I'm talking about years and decades, not just what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years, but over the course of the 21st century.
Wait, why is it wrong or imprudent to not say, okay, these are strong leaders, we can have alliances with them? We've done that, as you know, ever since World War II.
Yes, we had autocratic allies during the Cold War, and at times they were important to us. But our most enduring, closest allies were all democracies. And that was a great superpower we had during the Cold War, that we had really strong allies. The Soviets did not. And so I think in terms of managing and this new period of great power competition, we are better off supporting our democratic allies, number one, and supporting democratic ideas around the world, number two, because that's another advantage we have over the autocrats. Turns out, public opinion shows all over the world, it varies from country to country, but most people prefer to choose their leaders rather than have God, the Communist Party, or a soldier choose them. And if we give that away and we just act like the other autocrats, I think we lose that really vital instrument of soft power.
You talk about and wrestle with the concept of whether we're in a new Cold War, both with China and with Russia. Let's start with China. Are we in a new Cold War with China, and what do we learn from the old Cold War if that's the case?
Are we in a new Cold War with China? Yes. Let me say that question again. Are we in a new Cold War with China? No. That's why my book's so long, because I think this debate in the United States has gotten too oversimplistic. Either people didn't know what the Cold War was or forgot about it. And I see elements that are similar and different. So with China, two superpowers in the world, they're first among equals. Ideological competition, that is true. Both countries, do they seek to influence the world and not just their region? That's also true. That's like the Cold War. Will it last for decades? Tragically, I think this competition will last for decades, just like the Cold War did.
Well, tell me how it's different from the Cold War.
Well, I actually think the list of differences is longer than the list of similarities, and I won't try to go through all of them, but I think three are most important. So one, the most obvious, is that the U.S. and the Chinese economy are much more intertwined today than the American and Soviet economies were during the Cold War, and we've got to figure out how to deal with that. I think the idea that we just decouple and go our separate ways is not only imprudent, we don't need to do it, but I think trying to do so, we would fail. So we've got to figure out a different strategy than what we had for the Cold War for that set of problems. Secondly, there is an ideological dimension to this competition. My book, after all, is called Autocrats versus Democrats for a reason. But I don't think the ideological struggle is as intense as it was during the Cold War. The Soviets wanted the whole world to become communist, including the United States of America. I just don't see the evidence to support the hypothesis that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are doing that. Although that's a contentious debate, Walter, in my circles. Some people believe that. I think they're wrong about it. And I think they're overestimating the Chinese threat. But the third difference is about us. We are more polarized as a society than we were for most of the Cold War. We had some periods, obviously, in the late 60s, as you know better than I, and early 70s, that America was polarized. But I think it's deeper and more enduring now. And we're also in an era of isolationism. We most certainly, for longer than we were engaged in the world, had an isolationist tradition. We didn't during the Cold War. Democrats and Republicans basically agreed that we had to be engaged. They agreed to containment as a strategy, although that was a pretty elastic term during the Cold War. Now we have these isolationist tendencies, strongest in the Republican Party, but also prominent in the Democratic Party. And I just don't think that's a strategy for success in the 21st century. But in part, I wrote this book to try to push back on it.
President Trump is in Asia this week, meeting with Xi Jinping, among other things. Xi Jinping will try to pin him down on the Taiwan issue, which is whether the United States supports independence of Taiwan. What do you think is the best approach?
So when I teach at Stanford about history, I teach about events and big things like World War II and revolutions and things like that. But I also remind my students about non-events. Non-events don't get enough attention. The greatest non-event of the Cold War was the war that didn't happen over Taiwan. Tremendous diplomatic achievement, in my view. And we got to just keep that non-event continuing to happen. And I think that means two things in terms of the American foreign policy. One, enhance deterrence to make a war, an invasion of the island, costly. There are lots of things we can do. I go through them in the book, and there's lots of things the people of Taiwan need to do. But two, resist what some politicians say when they show up in Taipei, that we support independence. I think that's a recipe for disaster. And I just think keeping the status quo, however imperfect it is the best outcome that we can hope for.
President Trump, in his trip through Asia this week, did a whole lot of trade deals and alliances from Vietnam to Malaysia and other places. It almost seems like it's from your book that we need to create these alliances economically and in some ways politically. Do you think that that's working?
So each of those bilateral deals, and I would say other ones that the president has accomplished, those are positive signs for American prosperity and security. I applaud the president. What I don't like about his strategy is, one, he doesn't believe in trade fundamentally. He believes in tariffs. I think that is not smart for our long-term economic interests. Again, one of the great successes of the Cold War is that we united the free world with respect to trade and investment. And we used institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and later the World Trade Organization to unite the free world. After the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we went too fast to bring in the Chinese and the Russians to those clubs, and that when we paid the price for that. But generally speaking, uniting us around a common set of principles and rules of the game was a good strategy. What I don't like about the Trump strategy is it seems erratic. You know, an ad plays in Canada and suddenly we're putting tariffs on them. That's not a strategy.
You've said that you think that the rivalry and competition with China is a bit overestimated. And yet, do you feel that the Russian competition, our problems with Russia, is that underestimated?
Exactly. I think that we made a mistake there. And I say that as a former Obama administration official. I think we also made a mistake, which is when you go through the numbers, and I go through all the numbers in the book. I have lots of charts in the book. My editors didn't like that, Walter, way too many charts. But I thought it was important to show the data about the balance of power between China, Russia, and the United States. And when you do that, Russia looks weak, right? Yeah, they have nuclear weapons, so they're a superpower in that regard. But conventional military power, they're not near the China or the United States. Economically, they're way down, right? They're 11th out of the top 15 economies in the world. So capabilities-wide, Putin is not as strong as Xi in terms of capabilities. But when we talk about intentions, which are much harder to measure a priori before power is used, what we've seen time and time again for the last 15 years is that the power that Putin has, he's been willing to use it for, I think, very negative consequences, right? So he invaded Georgia in 2008. He went into Ukraine in 2014. He went into Syria with his Air Force in 2015. And then he launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine again in 2022. He doesn't have the same military that either the United States or China has, but what he has, he's using in these very imperial and I would say destabilizing ways. And I think we've made a mistake in underestimating that. You know, when I was in the government, we talked about pivot to Asia. So did Trump. So did the Biden administration, especially. And yes, we have to do more in Asia, but we also have to realize that the threat from Putin is real. And these things are intertwined, by the way. If Putin prevails in Ukraine, that emboldens Xi Jinping with respect to Taiwan. Conversely, if we stop Putin and we push him, at least push him to a stalemate in Ukraine, I think that makes Xi Jinping a little less likely to invade Taiwan. So these things are actually, I think, highly intertwined.
You talk about mistakes that may have been made during the Obama administration when you were there and rethinking things. One of the things that happened during the Obama administration was the idea of a reset, that we were going to suddenly reset our relations with Russia and have good relations. And you were at the core of that. Was that a mistake?
No, it wasn't a mistake. I think it was the right strategy. I was the Russia advisor at the NSC and then the ambassador. And our strategy, we took it right out of George Shultz's memoirs. Remember, he wasn't part of the original Reagan team. He comes in a couple years later, and he looks at the lack of interaction with the evil empire. That's what Reagan called the Soviets at the time. And he said, that's not smart. We got some interest with these folks. We got to engage them to pursue our interests. But we should do so without checking our values at the door. And I think that's a really great strategy for any American leader, for any Secretary of State when dealing with autocracies. So they got a bunch of things done, and so did we. We signed a START treaty, for instance, that got rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in the world. That's a good outcome for the American people and I think the world. Second, we developed this supply route through Russia to Afghanistan so that we could reduce our dependence on Pakistan. It was 95% of our material for our soldiers in Afghanistan went through Pakistan. And we did that because we planned to take the war against terrorists to Pakistan. And we did that in 2011 and killed Osama bin Laden. Couldn't do that without the Russians. 3, we wanted to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And we thought that multilateral sanctions passed by the UN Security Council was a necessary condition for doing that. You can't get a resolution through the UN Security Council without the Russians. We got them to vote for that, the most comprehensive set of sanctions against Iran ever. And that, I think, was a predicate for the Iran nuclear deal, which I still think was a good outcome for the American people. Now, the part I think people get wrong, or maybe we didn't articulate it well enough, the reset was never about holding hands and singing Kumbaya with these guys. I think that what we may have oversold that we had changed things, but all those outcomes were good for the American people, and I would do it just the same way if we had the chance to go back and rewrite history.
You were a young person in Russia working, I think, for the National Democratic Institute. When Glasnost and Perestroika brought down the Soviet Union, they opened up more democratic. Was there anything we could have done that would have not led to the rise of Putin and authoritarianism again?
Yeah, I think we did make some mistakes. I don't think we did enough to help them make the transition to markets and democracy, because we thought it was all over, right? It was the end of history, and we just thought everybody was going to become democratic. And so we didn't do with Russia that what we did do after World War II, Marshall Plan to help the countries become part of the West. I think had we done that, we would have better outcomes. 2, I still think it was the right strategy to try to help build democracy in Russia. Like you said, I moved there as a young kid to try to do that. I don't think that was a mistake, but we should have had a better hedge if it didn't work. And that hedge, in my view, should have been a much more expansive NATO, much more rapid when Russia was weak. And 2, if we couldn't get everybody into NATO because they didn't meet the criteria, we should have armed them. And I'm thinking principally here about Georgia and Ukraine. If Ukraine back in the 1990s had the weapon systems from the United States and NATO that they have today, I think that could have helped keep the peace. And that, I think, was a mistake. In retrospect, I wasn't making that argument, but I think the plan A was right, but we should have had a hedge in case it didn't work.
What should Trump be doing now? He's having such trouble trying to solve the Ukraine issue. Is there any way to solve it easily?
Not easily. Putin is an ideologue, as I write about in the book. Too many people think he's just a transactional guy that wants to do a deal. I heard that all the time when I worked at the White House, and I just don't see him that way. I think he is on an ideological crusade to defend what he calls, conservative Russian values against the liberal, decadent West. And that's his mindset. And he's also an imperialist. He wants to be in the history books like Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. So he's highly motivated by ideas and not transactions. But I do think we could do more. And it's the same thing I've been saying for 3.5 years. Greater sanctions and more and better weapons. Wars tend to end in two ways. Either there's a stalemate on the battlefield or one side wins. Right now, neither of those conditions are present. The Russians are incrementally taking Ukrainian territory, and we have to help the Ukrainian warriors stop that progress before I think Putin sits down and talks about doing a deal.
I want to ask you a big, broad historical question. It goes back to Thucydides. And I know you've read Graham Allison and the Thucydides Trap, but let me quote Thucydides when he's talking about rivals in power. He said, what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. Could we say that right now, that what makes war inevitable is the growth of Chinese power and the fear that causes in the United States? Is that going to be an inevitable tension, or is it something we can overcome?
It's going to be an inevitable tension. That's a good word, but not an inevitable war. There's a difference. And everything starts with power. Everything starts with Thucydides. I have 3 chapters in my book about the rise and fall of power. But I add 2 more factors to the equation. I add regime type and I add individual leaders. So I don't think we're just destined for war because of rise and fall of power. And sometimes it's happened, but sometimes it hasn't. Graham wrote about both those cases. We need to remember it's not inevitable. And part of my optimism about that is the Cold War. We use that phrase Cold War because we didn't have a war with the Soviets. We had lots of proxy wars and millions of people died. People forget that, on both sides of the red and blue teams. But we managed to avoid a great war between them because of leadership. And especially after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we got really close, leaders on both sides said, we got to manage this competition. And we developed a whole bunch of crisis prevention mechanisms to do so. I think those are some good lessons for leaders in China and America today.
Ambassador Michael McFaul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Next to Silicon Valley, where major U.S. tech firms are urged to stop exports to the Chinese police, with some lawmakers asking that they appear before Congress. Now, this comes after a recent Associated Press investigation revealed the direct role the U.S. companies have played in building Beijing's mass surveillance state. AP reporter Dae Kang investigated this story, and he joins Hari Srinivasan to talk about the complicity of American technology.
Bianna, thanks. Investigative reporter Dae Kang from the Associated Press, thanks so much for joining us. You had a recent piece that uncovered a layer of surveillance that's going on in China that had been previously unreported. But you, in your report, through documents that were handed over from a whistleblower, found connections to American companies. What did you find?
Yeah, basically what we found in these documents is that, in the past, there's been reporting about how American companies have provided components or products to the Chinese police. But what we found is that actually these American companies not only sold some goods to the Chinese police, they actually were complicit in designing the entire system from the top down and working very closely with the Chinese authorities in building the system. And so when you look at, the Chinese policing apparatus as it is today, I mean, it wouldn't have existed without the assistance of American companies. From the very beginning, back 25 years ago, American companies were there right at the start, designing and building these systems to a large degree so that the Chinese police could carry out, government repression, censorship, and control of its own people.
You write, quote, some directly pitch their tech as tools for Chinese police to control citizens. Marketing material from IBM, Dell, Cisco, and Seagate show their sales pitches made both publicly and privately cited Communist Party catchphrases on crushing protest, including stability maintenance, key persons, and abnormal gatherings, and named groups that stifle dissent, such as Internet Police, Sharp Eyes, and the Golden Shield. What's the Golden Shield?
Yeah, so the Golden Shield is basically China's digital policing apparatus. When it got started, it was a way of kind of getting a hold of the internet. The internet was this thing that the Chinese authorities saw as being uncontrollable. Anyone could just go log on online and say whatever they wanted. And so the Chinese authorities wanted some way to be able to control it. And then from that project, came this whole digital policing apparatus. They saw that the Chinese government had this need for digital censorship and surveillance, and they pitched their products for the Golden Shield, for the use of the Chinese police. And, some of the companies, they kind of vary in what they were selling. Some companies say, oh, we were just only selling hard drives, or we were just selling kind of, general purpose equipment and stuff like that. But when you actually look at these marketing materials, you find that a lot of these companies were very well aware of what their products were going to be used for. Some of the most damning material that we found was actually these classified government blueprints that show that IBM actually worked with a Chinese military and defense contractor to build out the Golden Shield Phase 2. And in those blueprints, you can actually see them say things like, consolidate Communist Party rule. You see these documents that, you see databases that show that they're monitoring people like, followers of dissident religious groups, or people in the far western region of Xinjiang, where, many Western governments say that there was a genocide. And so you see these documents and you see that these companies were actually quite active in pitching their gear to the Chinese police. And this is something that continues all the way up until quite recently, even though there's been repeated warnings about the way the Chinese police were using this kind of technology. And so, if you dig into these marketing materials, sometimes you see references to race. One post we found from Dell advertised, all race recognition with one of their facial recognition powered laptops. They're talking about things like blacklisted individuals, key personnel, which is this term that they use to track people that they think are politically sensitive. So, a lot of American companies in the past have basically claimed ignorance. They say, oh, we don't really know how our gear is being used. We don't really have any control over that. But what our article shows is that that's not the case.
For the record, IBM says if older systems, because some of these contracts were back in the early 2000s, if older systems are being abused today and IBM has no knowledge that they are, the misuse is entirely outside of IBM's control, was not contemplated by IBM decades ago, and in no way reflects on IBM today. So, in your story, you said that the Xinjiang government has said, we are using these technologies to prevent and combat terrorist and criminal activity. There is absolutely no such thing as large-scale human rights violations. Does that ring true, considering what you've seen on the ground?
Absolutely not. I've gone to Xinjiang personally, almost half a dozen times, and I've seen people be ordered into lines and having their phones checked personally. I've seen, particularly members of the Uyghur ethnicity being singled out, while members of China's Han majority ethnicity are kind of waved through security checkpoints. And so, the Chinese government has obviously gone on this big push to promote what it's doing in Xinjiang as being about combating terrorism, because they realized that this was damaging their reputation.
You have in your story this description of what's called basically a digital cage, Explain to our audience what that is. And you profile a family, but you say that this might affect up to 100,000 human beings in China. What's a digital cage? How does it work?
What the digital cage is that there's all these kind of invisible digital electronic systems that are kind of in place that are able to monitor and in some cases control the movement of the Chinese people. And for the vast majority of Chinese people, this is not a problem because, most people are not explicitly political. They're not going on the streets or, chanting or doing anything along those lines. And so these systems are not aimed directly at them. But the moment you do something that catches the state's attention for whatever reason, you say something against the party or whatever it is, then all of a sudden you might get blacklisted. And then if you're blacklisted, all of a sudden your life can totally change, right? You have police suddenly following you around, or you try to buy train tickets and then you get intercepted on the other side where there's officers waiting for you. I know this very well myself because as a journalist, I'm also a person that the state does monitor very closely. Obviously, I'm not in the same situation because they treat me with a certain degree of deference, knowing that I'm a foreign journalist. But there's this sense that you're always being watched and that, at any time the authorities could intervene in the situation. And what, this kind of digital policing is actually invisible to most people. And that's actually what makes it so insidious. It's repression, but it's invisible repression.
What are some of the human costs of this? I mean, what's the consequence to some of the people that you've been talking to in your stories?
This is something that I would really like to, I hope comes across in the story, is that this surveillance, it may not be prison, it may not necessarily be torture directly, but it's a form of psychological torture. That's the way a lot of my interviewees phrased it. Right. I mean, just the sense of just constantly being watched and monitored, it can turn you into a social pariah. I mean, one of the interviewees in our piece is basically a prisoner in his own home. He's basically stuck at home. Every time he goes out, there's police officers following him. They might tell him not to go certain places. His own family, they're freaked out by the officers constantly following them. And they've cut off all contact with him. Right. And so, for people who are targets of this digital policing apparatus, I mean, it really extracts a huge toll. And the moment you end up crossing the line in any way, then they can come after you and they can arrest you. And then they have all of this information that they've compiled on you that lists out, what you've done wrong, and then they can end up putting you in prison. Sometimes there's things like police officers following you, and then when you do something they don't like, even if it's technically legal, they end up beating you up. That's something that one of the interviewees in our story faced. He was beaten by bricks by the police, and he ended up in the hospital. But even when he was in the hospital, there were officers that were outside his hospital ward, inside, hanging a surveillance camera above his face on an IV drip. I mean, it's really surveillance to an extreme.
So you point out in your reporting that it's not just IBM that sold their software into China in the first place decades ago. You said, here it's that Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, ArcGIS, developer of Esri, sold hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of geographic and mapping equipment and software to Chinese police. NVIDIA and Intel, the chip companies, have partnered with Chinese surveillance companies to add AI capabilities to cameras used for video surveillance. Other companies like Intel, Thermo Fisher, Motorola, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Western Digital, and it's an enormous list of companies you're talking about. And before I let you answer here, you point out that Oracle, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and tech conglomerate Broadcom, which acquired VMware and cloud company Pivotal in 2023, did not comment on the record. HP, Motorola, and Huawei did not respond. IBM, Dell, Cisco, Intel, Thermo Fisher, and Amazon Web Services all said they adhere to export control policies. Seagate and Western Digital said they adhere to all relevant laws and regulations where they operate. And then Esri denied involvement but did not reply to examples. Microsoft told AP it found no evidence that it knowingly sold technology to the military or police as part of updates to the Golden Shield. So what kind of software did they sell? Are they possibly maintaining?
Yeah, some companies, they're actually actively marketing to the Chinese police for the purposes of the control of their own people, right? So that, in that particular case, companies might say, we didn't really know how our gear was being used, but the marketing material there says otherwise, right? Another thing that this really tells you is that there's a really wide variety of companies that are involved, right? I mean, Thermo Fisher, for example, what they're selling is actually DNA testing kits and things like that. They were actually explicitly marketing the ability of their test kits to also test members of China's Uyghur and Tibetan ethnicities as well, right? And so what you see here is that you really have like a broad array of American tech companies. They all kind of rushed into China, in the early 2000s because they saw China as being this huge untapped market. A lot of them ignored warnings about how that technology was being used. And then they end up, selling, often knowingly, to the Chinese police for purposes of repression.
There's a response from NVIDIA that kind of begs a different question. NVIDIA says, look, it does not make surveillance systems or software. It does not work with police in China, has not designed the H220 chip for police surveillance, and relationships with Chinese surveillance firms no longer continue. I mean, there's this argument that tech companies are going to make that, look, I'm selling a general use technology, right? A chip is a chip. You could put it in your phone. You could put it in your graphics processor and play video games with it. You could use it for AI and large language models. You can't penalize us for that. That's not what we're doing. NVIDIA is in kind of a special case where the US government is going to take 15% of any chip sales that it makes to China, right? What's the danger here?
Yeah, so NVIDIA is a really interesting case, as you point out, because chip companies like NVIDIA and Intel will make the argument that they really can't control where their chips go. The thing about that, though, is that we found evidence that both NVIDIA and Intel actively partnered with Chinese surveillance companies for policing applications. And in NVIDIA's case, they actually worked with a Chinese police research institute. They were testing facial recognition software with NVIDIA chips. And so what you're seeing here is that these companies are on the one hand saying they're not explicitly being designed for the purposes of surveillance, but they're very much assisting companies in figuring out how their chips can be used for surveillance applications. And so, we grilled them about it. I mean, we pointed to specific relationships that they had with specific Chinese companies. In many of the cases, they kind of dismissed them, saying, that was in the past. After the US government sanctioned those Chinese companies, we no longer have any business ties with them. But some partnerships with other companies continue. I mean, we saw in the case of NVIDIA that they actually touted how two Chinese companies who do sell to Chinese police were using NVIDIA chips. And so that really begs the question. I mean, are they just adhering to the letter of the law, not the spirit of it? They say, all the American companies that we spoke to say that they comply with U.S. export controls. But what we're seeing is that they're really kind of walking right up to the line of what is permissible. We did not find, hard evidence of violation of export controls. Export controls are very complicated. But in a lot of these cases, what these companies are doing is that they're actively working with these Chinese surveillance companies so long as they're not being sanctioned. And so, even though these chips are not being designed for the purposes of surveillance, they still very much end up in surveillance applications and with the assistance of these chip companies.
Since you've published your report, I mean, senators like Josh Hawley from Missouri have said, look, maybe these companies need to be summoned in front of Congress because there seem to be fairly sizable loopholes inside the existing export laws that enable this to happen. And this, from what you're showing here is that it's not just kind of the activists that are complaining and it's not just Democrats, but there seems to be some kind of a bipartisan consensus that this kind of behavior needs to be regulated.
Absolutely. This has been an issue for decades, right? There's been congressional hearings about this since the mid-2000s. But every time, members of Congress or people in the US government have tried to do something about this to close those loopholes, there's been pushback from American tech companies. So they spend a lot of money lobbying on the issue, ensuring that bills that could potentially close the loophole never come to a vote. You have all these bureaucratic procedures. The Department of Commerce is responsible for export controls, and they've actually tried numerous times to close some of these loopholes, but they've always ended up running out of time and facing opposition before they're actually able to put through those changes. And so this has been a longstanding issue, absolutely a bipartisan one.
It's worth noting that the White House and Department of Commerce, did not respond to your request for comment in this story. One other idea that it was fascinating in your piece is that right now your piece focuses on the influence that American technology companies had on the surveillance that's happening in the Chinese state, and that Chinese companies could have advanced that technology further. But what's also interesting is that you also point out that, look, this type of surveillance is being used well beyond China, that there is facial recognition software that's being used, whether it's on the southern border of the United States or in Gaza by Israel, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize in writing this report is that this is not just a China problem. I think a lot of people tend to think of, China as being this kind of digital totalitarian state. There's a lot of discourse about that, right? But it's not just a China issue. And in fact, I think it's quite telling that it was American companies that brought a lot of this technology to China, because that means that it's also an American problem. And that's something that one of our interviewees actually said when she was speaking with us. She said, right now it might be us Chinese that's suffering, but sooner or later, Americans and people from other countries will suffer the consequences as well.
Investigative reporter with the Associated Press, Dave Kang, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
When it comes to American history, it is the Holy Grail, the American Revolution, of course, but there is still much to be learned. That is certainly what our next guest thinks, and he should know. Ken Burns has been chronicling American history and culture for decades. He first rose to prominence 35 years ago with his PBS series on the Civil War, and now he's turning his lens to that much-vaunted American origin story, the American Revolution, with a new 12-hour documentary for PBS.
From a small spark kindled in America, a flame has arisen, not to be extinguished.
We think about independence movements of the 20th century. You don't always recognize the fact that the United States actually started that.
The American Revolutionary Movement served as a model for freedom from oppression.
America is predicated on an idea that tells us who we are, where we came from, and what our forebears were willing to die for.
Collins said no taxation without representation. The fear was, if we give in to this precedent, what will they do in the future?
Crisis changes people. It gave different people different ideas about what they should be doing.
It gave them a space to make this democracy real.
And he joins Walter Isaacson to talk about it.
Thank you, Christian. And Ken Burns, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Walter.
You have this multi-part series, The American Revolution, that's coming out. And you say that the American Revolution is the most important event since the birth of Christ. Whoa. Tell me why you think it was that important.
I wasn't trying to be provocative. I was just beginning to realize that there's a moment a little bit after the phrase pursuit of happiness, the great second sentence of the Declaration, where Jefferson says, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. It's not hard to parse. It just means that heretofore, everybody's been a subject to an authoritarian rule. And now we're creating this new thing called citizens. The Old Testament says there's nothing new under the sun. That's Ecclesiastes. So there's actually for a moment something new under the sun, and I want to rivet people's attention.
Do you think they felt it was that big of a deal?
Yes.
Or did they think it was a rebellion against taxes or something?
Well, it starts off that way. It gathers momentum like a snowball going down the hill. You know, at first it's Parliament and it's British complaints about British law, and then all of a sudden it gets broken out because it's the Enlightenment, you know, into universal truths, and then all of a sudden they're saying things like all men are created equal. Now, I know that Jefferson meant all white men of property free of debt, but the word all, as the scholar Yuval Levin says, you know, that's just like the walls of Jericho is just broken down. It's a trumpet that is going to just wear away. And even though it's 69 years before slavery ends, and it's an unforgivable 144 years before women get the right to vote, this is a big deal. So it's constantly enlarging. And if you think about it, the whole project is about that. It's pursuit of happiness. It's a more perfect union. We're sort of a nation in the process of becoming, and this is our big bang of which we know nothing about. And we're in an expanding universe, even when we can fret and chicken little a particular moment and say we're so divided. We'll go back to our revolution. We're as divided as ever. It's a revolution, and it's a bloody one. It's also a civil war in a way that our own civil war is a sectional war, and it's also a global war, and it is the fourth global war over the prize of North America. So you've got all of these free electrons sort of banging around this thing. And they're people, though, they know how important it is. They're talking about us. They're talking about you and me, Walter. They're saying millions yet unborn. They have a sense of a responsibility, not just to themselves and their families and this crazy, impossible, never going to happen idea that has zero chance of success at Lexington Green on April 1975.
We are in the very midst of a revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations. Objects of the most stupendous magnitude, and measures in which the lives and liberties of millions yet unborn are intimately interested, are now before us. John Adams.
And it's just a spectacular thing. And it's not just the top-down guys. It's not just the bold-faced names who have sort of been so encrusted with the barnacles of sentimentality. Our job is to sort of make them a little bit more human and dimensional and people that you can relate to. But the better thing is to introduce you to literally scores and scores of other people I'd never heard about who are central to this story as well.
You talk about the barnacles of sentimentality that have encrusted, and we all think of the grand statesmen who go into Independence Hall, but your whole show, as you just said, is about the ordinary people, the ones where the bullet goes thud and it hits their chest.
It hits them.
Or the slave, or the woman home spinning. How did you decide to tell it through so many people as opposed to the grand leaders of the revolution?
Well, you know, they're not mutually exclusive, and that's the problem with our binary sensibilities today. We're so dialectically preoccupied, you think you have to then throw everybody out. George Washington had slaves, so he's got to go, well, we don't have a country without George Washington. So you're going to just have to get over that there's this stuff and there's this stuff, and the scales of justice and his creator has dealt with him in this. But we need to tell all the stories and tell a complicated and dimensional story. So when I say the prize of North America, what am I talking about? I'm talking about land. Well, who occupies that land? Hundreds of different peoples, not them, but hundreds of peoples who've been on the world scene, in at least those on the eastern seaboard and the Ohio Valley. They've been on the world scene in trade and in diplomacy for centuries. They know Britain, they know Spain, they know France, they know the Dutch. It is each one of them has a different set, and it's their confederacies, their union among the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, that inspires Franklin 20 years before the Revolution to say, hey, we could do this. We could have a union just like them. And
wait, explain that a bit more, because it's key to what you do, which is they have a federated of the 6 nations, and it's a federal system. And Ben Franklin says, okay, the Albany plan, we'll make that our system.
So he draws a picture of a cut up snake most of the states. And underneath it is this dire warning, join or die. And he convenes 7 of the 13 colonies at Albany in 1754, and they adopt his plan of union based on the Haudenosaunee, the 6 nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk of the Iroquois Confederacy. And then they go home to try to sell it. Nobody wants to give up their autonomy. Not a single colony wants to give up their autonomy. So the plan dies, but 20 years later, join or die is a war cry in the most consequential revolution in history. So you've got to center, whatever the common word is, a Native American experience. Half the population are women. Out of the 3 million people, 500,000 are enslaved or free Black Americans. You've got Spanish to the south. You've got French licking their wounds. You have British hiring German soldiers. You have backcountry people. You have educated sort of the elites, we'd call them today, who are trying to sort of figure out, well, maybe we are going to split and we're going to start a republic. The dynamism is so intense that you just can't ignore it. Let me just take one kid, 15 years old, signs up a few days after the Declaration in July of 1776, Joseph Plum Martin from Connecticut. He's the archetypal grunt you've met in every film about the Civil War, about World War II, about Vietnam, complaining about the food, complaining about the weather, complaining about the orders, and he's there from the beginning.
By the way, you got his letters.
We got his
Explain
letters.
how those type of things that form this film.
Every private soldier in an army thinks his particular services as essential to carry on the war he's engaged in as the services of the most influential general. And why not? What could officers do without such men? Nothing at all. Great men get great praise. Little men, nothing.
Joseph Plum Martin comes in. He's blooded in the Battle of Long Island, which is the biggest battle and a total disaster for the Patriots. But he's there at Redoubt number 10 at Yorktown, that's being led by Lafayette and by Alexander Hamilton. But he's leading the charge into this redoubt with the abattis, the spiked French, the logs of the British positions. And he says, the man at my left was hit with a bullet and falls crying bitterly, but there was no stopping us. And there's a great famous painting of the attack over Redoubt number 10, but it is so powerful that there's Joseph Plum Martin, who's right behind him, free Black soldiers from Rhode Island who've been promised their freedom once the war is over. And even Connecticut and Rhode Island are talking about compensating their owners for the property that they've lost as a result of this. In this one charge, you've got a Frenchman, our pal, you've got Alexander Hamilton, who has played a huge role and will continue to play a huge role in the history of the United States. And this is what we tried to capture and bottle. We followed reenactors for 6 years, filming them not to reenact this battle, but to collect a critical mass of imagery to offset the fact that clearly, obviously, there's no photographs and no newsreels. But that doesn't mean those people are different than us. Photographs sort of prove a similarity, and we see the paintings and the buckles and the hose and the breeches and the waistcoats and the powdered wigs and think, they can't be like us. They're exactly like us.
Well, as you say, it's a tapestry filled with all sorts of people, large and small. But the hero line throughout is George Washington, the person you've mentioned who's done it all. But you do have to wrestle with the fact that he not only is an enslaver, but a pretty cruel one at that. He also loses a lot of battles and lots of blunders, and he was ruthless to the Native Americans. I think you quote Jane Kaminsky in episode 2, "Do not look for the gilded statues of marble men."
That's right. That's
the theme of what you've done, is make these people flesh, not marble. But explain how hard that was with Washington.
Well, first of all, Washington is so endlessly interesting. But there's no opacity to him. But as you say, if you can take him all in all, then he's dimensional in his failures. He's also incredibly modest. And so the letters that he writes, and so I got the actor Josh Brolin to play him. And I said, Josh, this man is unknowable. Can you help me understand a little bit about him? Let that leak in a little bit.
The unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years was little short of a standing miracle. George Washington.
Let's just put it this way. Without Washington's leadership, we don't have a country. And that's the key to this, is that what we do, particularly in a media culture or a computer culture where everything's a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no, a red state or a blue state, is we think it's just divided that way. But everybody has complication and undertow. But, you've got to be able to understand people in their totality and to celebrate that contradiction. And this reminds us of our own lives, the own paradoxes within ourselves and the paradoxes we feel to the people that are closest to us, that we love the most, who remain in some ways inscrutable to us. So good history is, of course, thinking it might not turn out the way you know it did.
So many of your documentaries deal with race. Whether it's jazz, whether it's baseball, whether it's civil rights. This one deals with race, too. Explain how you felt race was so critical here.
Well, look, it's there in all my other films because the guy who wrote our catechism, the second sentence of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You and I know the story of the word self-evident. More complicated than that all men are created equal. Let's stop there. Owned hundreds of human beings and didn't see the contradiction, didn't see the hypocrisy, and didn't see fit in his lifetime to free any of those slaves, and set in motion an American narrative, not responsible entirely to Jefferson, but symbolically attached to Jefferson, because he gave words to our aspirations, our noblest aspirations. So this is going to play out all through the decades, but no more so in this moment when the people, particularly Southern planters and enslavers of a great number of people, are describing what they think George III is doing to them as enslaving them. And the liberty talk, as Jane Kaminsky says in our film, is leaky. The people that are serving them are hearing it, and they want it too. Native Americans want it. Women want it too.
Well, you give voice to a lot of enslaved and former slaves. And one of the things that struck me is how they had to choose sides in this revolution. And I think, 15,000 or so end up on the British side, and less than that, 5,000 end up on the Patriot side. Tell me about having to make that choice.
So the entire British Empire's profit depends on the 13 colonies in the Caribbean that are hugely profitable because it's the work of enslaved people. And our 13 are the least profitable, and only Virginia and the Carolinas, for the obvious reason, have some profitability for the British Empire. But cynically, Lord Dunmore, who owns other human beings himself, says, well, if you're an enslaved person of a rebel, please come and get your freedom from me. If you're the enslaved person of a loyalist, by the way, stay where you are. You're enslaved for the rest of your life, right? So you're seeing black families making decisions about what to do, running for daylight. And as it turns out, many of them make a decision to fight with the British, or at least align themselves with the British. 5,000 make a decision to fight. We think 20,000 are engaged, 15 fight for the British. Native Americans are making the same kind of choice, but also all other Americans are too. This is a bloody civil war. There are people who are loyalists and saying, all of my good fortune, all of my literacy, my health, the fact that I own land when my family for 1,000 years was working dependent land in Wales and Scotland and Ireland and England, never had this chance. I have it here. Why am I going to risk it for this crazy, untested idea when the British constitutional monarchy looks to be the finest form of government on earth, at least in the Western sense of that? They're not wrong. And so we don't make loyalists bad people. We make them understandable. We have Roger Lamb, an Irish soldier, watching in a lull in the fighting at the Battle of Saratoga. One British soldier, they're trading insults or jokes or whatever. They're happy to have a lull, as all soldiers are. And one just gets up and runs down, jumps in the water and swims midstream. Meanwhile, an American gets down and jumps, and they're two brothers. They embrace midstream. They didn't know they hadn't talked to each other, seen each other for years, and they were on the other side trying to kill each other in the Battle of Saratoga.
Let me read you some of the charges from the end of the Declaration of Independence against the king. And they kind of resonate today in what we would think. One of it is for obstructing laws for naturalization, refusing to encourage immigration here, made judges dependent on his will, kept among us standing armies in times of peace, quartering bodies of armed troops among us, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, and he's excited domestic insurrections against us. Every one of those, you might notice, could be echoed today.
Our friend Mark Twain is supposed to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, which of course it doesn't. No event has happened twice. But Twain said it rhymes. And anybody who spent any time talking about the past suddenly realizes in every instance, my first film that was on PBS, back in the early 80s on the Brooklyn Bridge, rhymed with things that were going on. This rhymes in spectacular ways. And our job is to tell what happened and to know that it will rhyme, but also to be aware of the fact that you date your film if you say, isn't this so much like this moment? Because what you want with good history is to have it be durable. So anything that that puts my thumb on the scale and says, oh, isn't this like today, is a distraction. It is always going to be like today and tomorrow as it was yesterday. And we benefit from what's happened over the last 50 years in this increase of knowledge since the bicentennial to the semi-quincentennial that gives us a chance to have a complicated American conversation with, I hope, little shouting.
Ken Burns, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Now, as we've been discussing, despite some worrying economic results, President Trump has been taking a victory lap to mark the first 100 days of his second term, going so far as to say his success surpasses any in U.S. history.
We're here tonight in the heartland of our nation to celebrate the most successful first 100 days of any administration in the history of our country, and that's according to many, many people.
Well, perhaps not according to our next guest, the presidential historian Timothy Naftali, who puts the Trump presidency in full context for Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Christian and Tim Naftali. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Walter.
So we're at the 100-day mark of this second Trump administration. What's your take on it so far?
I think we should assess the Trump 100 days in light of the gold standard for 100 days. The whole term comes from the first term of Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt's main theme was to banish fear from the American space. He wanted to restore the American people's confidence in American institutions, banks, the federal government. He wanted Americans to feel that they had some predictive capacity over the future. And by those standards, I think Donald Trump has done the opposite. I think Donald Trump has tried to introduce fear into the American space, fear among American universities, fear among American law firms, fear among international students and recent immigrants, fear among members of the Republican Party on the Hill. So in that sense, the 100 days that we have witnessed, which have been as active and revolutionary as FDR's 100 days, have had the exact opposite objective. And I think that's why it'll be safe to say that liberal and conservative historians in the future will look upon these 100 days as destructive.
Well, one of the big differences between the 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt and of Trump is that Franklin Roosevelt did most of his work by passing laws through Congress. I think there were 12 major pieces of legislation. Trump has not followed that route. Why, and what does that mean?
Franklin Roosevelt, even though it was a 100 days, a period led by Congress, many people associated this activity with Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt, in his third fireside chat after the 100 days, made clear to everyone that what he was doing was in the American tradition, that he was simply implementing laws passed by Congress. So he, too, understood that the American tradition was not to have a dictator. Fast forward to our current time, President Trump has sought to act as if he were the only branch of government. We do not live in a dictatorship, but he has acted in the style of a dictator.
Oh, wait, let me stop you there, which is, whose fault is that? I mean, it's Congress is the thing not standing up to him.
Well, he hasn't encouraged two things. He has gone about his business acting both rhetorically and physically as if there is no other branch of government. And indeed, when branches of government have stood up to him, he has been vicious in denouncing them. We just saw a perp walk of an American judge, a judge. So when the other branches of government have sought to oppose him, he has not acted in the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt by speaking of the national government. He has talked about the presidency as the seat of all power. So, yes, whose fault is it that there is a permissive environment for this activity? Of course, it's the fault of elected Republicans who have been, as we learned from Senator Murkowski, fearful of opposing their president. So that's why I'm talking about the installation of fear, not simply in private institutions, but in the Republican Party itself.
Well, let's go to that Senator Murkowski quote, because it struck me. She said, "We are all afraid. We're in a time and a place I've not been here before. I'm oftentimes very anxious myself about using my voice. Retaliation is real." What do you make of that?
It chills me. It's a chilling statement by the senator, and it echoes something that Mitt Romney, I think, wrote in his diary. It appears in his authorized biography, where he had hired, when he was senator, he had hired security for his family. And he wrote, I think it was during the first impeachment in 2019, that he understood why there were so many of his colleagues who knew that they should be voting for impeachment, but were afraid to, because they were afraid of the effect on their families, physical effect. And he said, they can't afford 24/7 security the way I can. So that echoed the fear that existed back in the first Trump administration. We saw that also with the way in which the Senate dealt with the confirmations of President Trump's new cabinet. There were a number of senators who found a way to leak the fact they were not happy with some of President Trump's choices. For example, Secretary Hegseth at the Pentagon, or RFK Jr. at Health and Human Services. But in the end, they were so fearful of a primary challenge, and I think also fearful of their own supporters, that they fell into line.
Well, wait, there's a big difference between being fearful of a primary challenge because you voted against the way people in your district may want, or being fearful of physical harm and you got to hire a bodyguard. What do you think this is?
Well, Walter, let's make clear that the first branding of this new Trump administration, in my view, was the pardoning of the January 6th felons. When you pardon violent felons, you are sending a signal about law and order in America. And unlike President Andrew Johnson, not one of my favorites, but President Johnson, when he issued a blanket pardon to the leaders of the rebellion in 1868, he did not deny that they had committed a crime. His pardon talks about those who led a rebellion against the lawfully authorized government of the United States. But when Donald Trump issued his pardon, he issued it after he said, after 4 years of injustice, making the point that the January 6th insurrection was just. So when you set that kind of tone, you're inviting vigilantism. I'm not saying that Donald Trump wants it. I want everyone to understand I'm talking about a spirit here. But there are many Americans who might be troubled, who might see the way in which the president is speaking of January 6th as license to engage in violence against those who oppose Donald Trump.
One of the historical comparisons that comes to mind is with Andrew Jackson, who very much was a populist expanding executive power. And in one of his actions, which was removal of Native Americans, the Indian removal, it's almost in some ways echoes the removal of unauthorized immigrants that Trump is trying to do. And when the Supreme Court said don't do that to Jackson, just like they've just said it, don't do that to Trump, the tale is that Jackson basically intimated, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let us see him enforce it. Do you worry that Trump may just defy like that Supreme Court?
I don't know what Donald Trump will do when push comes to shove, because I anticipate Donald Trump will lose a series of very important cases. I suspect, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on television, but I do know something about federal assistance to universities. I think Donald Trump's DOJ will lose the case against Harvard. I suspect he's going to lose the case regarding birthright citizenship. I assume he's going to lose some of the immigration cases. He's already started to lose them. And I think there will be enormous pressure from the MAGA wing on this president to defy the courts. And I cannot predict what Donald Trump will do. I hope that he will conclude that he can't defy the courts, but I can't predict that because this Donald Trump is an unleashed, unplugged Donald Trump from the person we saw in the first term. The first term, Donald Trump accepted having people around him who could dissuade him from his impulses. In the second term, Donald Trump made clear in the campaign, by the way, that he wanted no guardrails. He wanted no so-called adults. He wanted unfiltered Trumpism in his second term. Whether or not unfiltered Trumpism means defying the court and talking like Jackson is something to be seen.
What happens if he does defy a court order? Who could step in? We know the FBI is pretty much under his control. Even to some extent, it seems the top officers of the military, the U.S. attorney, maybe in Washington, is a loyalist. Who could step in?
Under my understanding of constitutional tradition, there isn't anyone who can step in because we have three equal branches. The Supreme Court has a marshal's service to protect the lives of the members of the Supreme Court. Thank goodness. In this very pitched, dangerous moment, it's very important for us to have a Supreme Court that doesn't have to worry about its physical security. But the Supreme Court doesn't have an army. One salutary, one sign of hope is that in our country, when you take an oath, the oath of office, you take it to the Constitution. And even though Donald Trump doesn't accept the norm, might not accept the norm, that the president must defer to the Supreme Court on matters of the Constitution, it is not clear that the leadership of the U.S. military would accept the commander-in-chief's interpretation of this norm. I am not suggesting, nor do I wish, that the U.S. military should have to intervene to preserve our Constitution, because that puts us in a category of nations where we do not wish to be. But keep in mind that the leaders of our military do not give an oath to the president. It's to the Constitution.
But wait, do you worry then about the way he changed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the way he put a somewhat unconventional pick as Secretary of Defense, all loyalists to him?
Yes, I worry. I worry deeply, Walter. One of the lessons of studying the periods in our history when we've had quasi-authoritarians in power is that the system can correct itself or right itself. And usually it rights itself because members of the, I don't want to use the term elite, but among those with power and influence in our society come to a bipartisan understanding that authoritarian action threatens the fabric of of who we are, of our society. And so in 1974, you had elected Republicans come to the conclusion that Richard Nixon had to go. In the 1950s, you had elected Republicans who came to the conclusion that Joe McCarthy's reign of terror had to end. That's how our system works. It doesn't work because the opponents to the president succeed.
Are you seeing some signs that that could happen? Are there things changing?
Not yet. I saw glimmers of this when a few Republican senators decided to send a note of disapproval to the president regarding tariffs on Canada. But those senators understood that they lacked the power to change the president's approach on tariffs towards Canada. But they did send a signal. What I am seeing, though, are the beginnings of a retrenchment on the part of the president that indicate to me that the president and his inner team think they might be losing popular support. So we are seeing the president pull back a little bit on the issue of international students. It's not quite clear what's going to happen to the Liberation Day tariffs, which have been universally denounced for being stupid. Besides being high, they don't actually have any economic logic attached to them. And the public isn't buying them. The president's approval ratings on the economy are lower than they have been. I believe they're lower than they were in the first term on the economy. So the president himself is retrenching a little. So I see a little bit of institutional pushback on the Hill. I see a lot more institutional pushback on the part of universities and some law firms. So we're beginning to see a reawakening of the American constitutional order. But let's be fair and let's be clear about this. For the first 2/3 of this 100 days, it appeared that the American constitutional system was asleep and the president was acting without any pushback. The situation has changed, and I think will continue to change.
One of the things that has driven his popularity is he's tapped into resentments against the elite that you just mentioned might be there to save us. I think at one point in the campaign rally in 2024, he said, "I am your warrior. I am your justice. For those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution."
Yes.
He's even pushed retribution against people like Cheney or against the law firms and others. Do you think this spirit of retribution is something that he's actually tapped into, and how dangerous is that?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that he has tapped into a popular desire for change, and in some cases for retribution. I think the disquiet in our country goes back to the Great Recession and the unequal recovery that that regions of this country experienced. I don't doubt that the pandemic sharpened unhappiness and divisions in our country. I think about 15, 20 years from now, we're going to have pandemic studies in various universities because I don't think we fully absorbed or processed the actual effect, political, cultural, and social, of the pandemic on our country, let alone the world. So yes, there was a lot of disquiet and anger that he could tap into.
If you look at Nixon's campaign, he ran on resentments to the elite. So did Andrew Jackson. We've had this before.
He ran on resentments, but what he didn't promise was retribution. That's the key difference. He wanted retribution, and he tried to use his government to achieve it, but good government Republicans pushed back and wouldn't allow him to do what he wanted to do with the IRS. The enemies list was initially his idea as a tax list, and he was never able to implement it. My point simply is that American leaders have tapped into resentment, whether it was resentment in the South for the Civil Rights Revolution. Yes. What Donald Trump did that's so different is that he made retribution his governing philosophy, and he told everyone he would. And now he's doing it. Now, the question I have for fellow Americans is that who we are? Is that how we want to be governed? And I'm not convinced, Walter, that there is a sustainable, broad governing coalition behind a government of retribution. But maybe I'm an optimist. I don't know.
Tim Naftali, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for asking me on. Thank you, Walter.
Now to Texas, where a new redistricting plan, backed by Republicans, is causing a political standoff. Critics accuse them of a partisan power grab as they look to gerrymander more safe seats ahead of the next congressional election. So say the Democrats, many of whom left the state in an attempt to stall this proposal. State Representative James Tallarico joins Michelle Martin to explain why.
Thanks, Christian. Representative Tallarico, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've got the Texas flag behind you, but you're not actually in Texas. Do you mind telling us where you are?
We're in the state of Illinois. We're trying to be careful because of security concerns. As I'm sure you've reported, President Trump has threatened to send the FBI to come find us. Governor Abbott has threatened to remove us from our duly elected positions in the legislature. And then Ken Paxton, our attorney general in Texas, sent out a tweet to his thousands of followers asking them to, quote, hunt us down. And so because of all that, we've received a lot of threats, including multiple bomb threats.
Yeah, I heard that there were bomb threats at the place where you were staying. But so when did the idea of breaking quorum, of leaving the state in order to deny the Republicans a quorum, first emerge? How did that happen?
Well, it was when we first started seeing reporting that the president was going to ask Texas Republicans to redraw our political maps in the middle of the decade. Typically, this is done at the beginning of a decade after a new census. That's exactly what happened in Texas in 2021. And once we heard that they may try to rig these maps in the middle of the game so that the president doesn't have to face accountability in the midterms, we knew we may have to take some dramatic actions to protect the democratic process, not just in Texas, but across the country. And so this is, we're not fighting for just Democrats. We're fighting for independents and Republicans, too. This is about whether or not the people, all of us, can change our government from the bottom up, whether we can hold powerful people, including the most powerful man in the country, accountable.
This isn't exactly easy. You got to leave whatever job you have that, the Texas legislature is not, full time. So you have other things to do. You have family members. It's not easy on people's lives. So I just was curious about what were some of the conversations that you had in the caucus about, whether this was the right thing to do or not.
Yeah, it was certainly not a decision we made lightly. As you mentioned, many of my colleagues are leaving behind young children. Some of them are leaving behind aging parents. We're all leaving behind our day jobs, which is how we make ends meet and pay our bills. But we know that this is a lot bigger than us. It's a lot bigger than any one politician or any one political party. This is about whether or not people can elect the representatives of their choice, which is the most fundamental part of this representative democracy. And so we felt like we had to take a stand. And thankfully, we, over the past week, I think, have really focused the country's attention on this power grab in Texas. I know that the Google searches for gerrymandering and redistricting are through the roof, which, as a former teacher, that makes my heart happy that people are using this opportunity to learn about our broken political system. And hopefully it sparks a conversation about how to fix this democracy going forward so that it works for everybody.
The Republicans control the governor's office. They control all the top state offices, both United States senators, the attorney general, the governor, et cetera, and both houses of the legislature. OK, but in 2021, Democrats did the same thing to deny Republicans a quorum. That was not perceived as a success. Do you disagree with that assessment? I mean, the bill that you were trying to stop passed anyway. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I would disagree with that assessment, that analysis. When we broke quorum in 2021, it was over a voter suppression bill. And I should say this quorum break and that quorum break, those are the only two quorum breaks in 20 years in Texas. So this is not a common occurrence because of the tremendous cost, financial, personal, political, legal. It's not something that should be undergone without a lot of thought and without a lot of justification. It's an extreme tool that the minority has in our toolbox, and it's protected by the Texas state constitution. And so we're not breaking any laws. We're not doing anything that's not in the House rules. And it's why it's so strange that people are threatening us with arrest and with vacating our seats, because there's a long tradition in Texas and in America. We're here in the land of Lincoln. Abe Lincoln broke quorum as a state senator back in 1840 by jumping out of a window at the Illinois state capitol. So this is a time-honored tradition, and it's not something that we undergo lightly. And so to answer your question, that last quorum break in 2021 over the voter suppression bill, while it didn't kill the bill, it did put a national spotlight on the issue, which pressured our Republican colleagues to take the worst parts out of that bill. A ban on souls to the polls, which is Sunday morning voting, when a lot of African American churches take their members to have their voices heard in the democratic process. That was taken out of the bill. A provision that would have allowed Republicans in our state to overturn election results that they didn't like, that was taken out of the bill, all because of our quorum break and the attention that it galvanized across the nation.
But, the governor is threatening to try to find a way to vacate your seats so that he can then appoint people to replace you, calling on the FBI, which, of course, Republicans do control now, to go and bring you in, as it were. They're talking about deputizing, the Texas Rangers to somehow cross state lines, which they do not have the authority to do at present. And then they're also talking about, I don't know how this would work, but charging you with bribery if you use any campaign funds to subsidize the costs of this, sort of experience. Do any of those, in your estimation, have any legal force at all?
No. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm a former public school teacher, but I've got a lot of colleagues who are very talented lawyers. And we've brought on a team of lawyers to help us given these threats. All of them agree that the legal theories underpinning these threats are laughable. That doesn't mean they won't succeed. I mean, our courts are highly politicized, especially in Texas. And so we'll see if it works. But if we're just going by rule of law, I think these should be laughed out of court. And I think it's equally laughable that Ken Paxton, the most corrupt politician in Texas, perhaps the most corrupt politician in the country, is accusing us of bribery when he was literally impeached on a bipartisan basis in the Texas House of Representatives for his corruption and for enriching himself and his donors. So this is hypocrisy at the highest level. And I think it's important to realize that this redistricting attempt, this power grab, is corrupt too. We oftentimes think of corruption as just involving money. That is certainly one kind of corruption, but corruption is the abuse of power. It's the betrayal of the public trust. And this is corruption at the highest level.
So talk about the maps then. It's not exactly a secret what their objective is. I mean, their objective is, at the request of the president, he was very clear about this too, to redraw the lines to give Republicans the advantage, or so they believe, in 5 additional seats. And that would mean consolidating seats that are currently held by Democrats, or just basically redrawing the lines. And even the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't redistrict along racial lines. Their argument is that this isn't racial at all. This is partisan, and that's perfectly allowed. What do you say about that?
Well, one, I would disagree that this is not racial gerrymandering. You take a look at these maps and the communities they divide, the voices they dilute. It is primarily Black and brown. It is African-American communities and it's Latino communities across the state of Texas, 2 growing populations in our state that they are disenfranchising with this racist and discriminatory gerrymandering. But I also want to point out how crazy it is that they seem to be very okay admitting publicly that this is a naked political power grab. That may be legal, but it is certainly not moral. It is certainly not supported by the vast majority of Americans. There was polling data released earlier this week showing that this power grab in Texas is wildly unpopular across the state of Texas, including among Trump supporters, because no one likes cheating and no one likes rigging an upcoming election. People should be evaluated on their policies and their record. And if those policies are unpopular, then you should face consequences as an elected official, regardless of your political party. And unfortunately, the president has been embroiled in corruption, receiving planes from a foreign government. He's kicking millions of people off their health care to fund tax breaks for billionaires. And those policies and those actions are unpopular. And as the most powerful man in the country, he needs accountability. He needs to face consequences at the ballot box. not just for all of us, but for him. That will make him a better president. So even if you're a Trump supporter, him facing accountability in the next election will make him a better leader for all of us. And I hope we all want that, regardless of how we feel about the president.
It's interesting that your Governor Abbott, Greg Abbott, in a number of his interviews particularly with the conservative media, it has to be said, his argument is that the Democrats who are cheating by leaving the state. He says that Texans stay and fight. And that you're abdicating your responsibility, but it's also that you're the ones who are not willing to stay and fight and argue it out. What would you say to that?
Well, we're not running away from a fight. We're running into the fight. We're running to the front lines of this fight and taking on a lot of risk to do it. We're the ones facing threats, including threats of violence. And Greg Abbott's in his fancy mansion surrounded by security detail. So you tell me who is more courageous in this fight. And I'll just say again that we are taking on all this risk so that we can fight for the people. I think there's a stark moral difference here. Greg Abbott and Texas Republican politicians are willing to disempower the people of Texas to protect their positions. Texas Democrats are willing to give up our positions to empower the people of Texas. That is the starkest contrast that you can draw. And I'm happy to have the people of our state judge us on those merits.
The other argument that people are making, and I've heard this again in the conservative media, is that the Democrats have left for states that are themselves heavily gerrymandered, that have an historic, there's an historic precedent in many of these states for substantially gerrymandered districts, which happen to favor Democrats. So what would you say to that?
I've condemned those maps, including the one here in Illinois. Gerrymandering is wrong, whichever party does it, in whatever part of the country it's done. We have to get gerrymandering out of our politics. And, Democrats in Congress, when they had the majority, they tried to pass a ban on partisan gerrymandering for the whole country, in red states and blue states. And every single Republican in Congress voted against that ban. But gerrymandering is a bipartisan problem and it has to end. All I want to say is that what's happening here in Texas is a whole nother level of corruption and rigging of the system. It's being done in the middle of the decade, and it's being done at the direct request of the most powerful man in the country. And if people can't understand how that is a lot more dangerous than typical gerrymandering, then I think we've got work to do to help people wake up to what's happening in their name, in their government, because these politicians are trying to pick their voters instead of voters picking their politicians. And if we walk down that road, I'm worried about where it leads.
And speaking of walking down that road, Democrats in some states like California and New York are saying it's time to fight fire with fire. Governor Newsom in California, Governor Hochul in New York is saying, okay, Texas, if you're going to go down that road, we're going to try to amend our state constitutions to do something similar. And some of them say this with regret, but others say, it's about time. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that word "if" is very important. This should only be done in self-defense. I do not support any preemptive gerrymandering in blue states. I only think this should happen if Texas Republicans go through with this power grab and cheat before the upcoming election. If that happens, then all bets are off. And the Democratic Party cannot unilaterally disarm. You stop a bully by standing up to them, by looking them right in the eye and not blinking. And that's exactly what Democrats need to do if the bullies go forward with their plan in Texas.
You've actually introduced an independent redistricting commission bill in every session since 2021. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that idea doesn't have more appeal?
Because this is not an issue of party, it's an issue of power. The people in power want to hold on to power at the tale as old as time. And this is one of the ways they do it, by gerrymandering. Again, in both political parties, they draw these maps into these crazy shapes to manufacture the outcome they want, to insulate themselves from the will of the public. Again, nothing could be more un-American, nothing could be more undemocratic than that. And it is what leads to extremism in our politics. My constituents often ask me why we at the state legislature aren't focused on funding schools, making neighborhoods safer, expanding access to healthcare, lowering property taxes. Why do we focus on all this crazy culture war stuff? And I tell them redistricting, gerrymandering. When you have deep red seats and deep blue seats, and that's all you don't have swing seats anymore, then the only competition for a politician is in their primary, because the general election is predetermined. And so when the only competition is in your primary, that means the people you have to please are your farthest, most extreme flank of your base. True for Republicans and true for a lot of Democrats. And that is why you see such extremism in our political discourse. Gerrymandering is the rot at the core of our broken political system, and we have to ban it everywhere in all states.
The question for you as a Democrat is, how are you so sure that most of the people in the state don't agree with the Republicans? I think that what they're doing is just fine. How do you know?
And that may be true. Texas got more competitive. I remember when I was growing up in Texas, Democrats lost statewide by 25, 30 points. Now we consistently lose by only single digits. And Joe Biden in 2020 against Donald Trump, it was a 5-point gap in our state. So Texas is not this deep red state that a lot of people think it is. We're much more of a pink state right now, trending toward purple. You had mentioned earlier that we're a small minority in the Texas legislature. That's actually not true. The only reason we can break quorum is because we're such a large minority. We control about 42, 43% of the seats in the lower chamber. If we were a tiny minority, we couldn't break quorum because we wouldn't have enough members to halt business on the floor. And so I would say to your question, that we should all be trying to compete for these votes. And I think that is true for Republicans too. And I don't think you'd be trying to cheat if you felt like you were going to win the next election.
So what would victory look like for you at the moment? Do you see any movement here? Do you see any possibility that there might be a meeting of the minds that would allow you to come home?
I mean, I hope for that. I pray for that. But I am planning, and my colleagues and I are planning for if that doesn't happen. One, I think the public backlash has been overwhelming, again, across the political spectrum, and that's a good thing. Second, I think you're seeing these blue states with trifectas moving toward retaliation. I'm hopeful that that will convince my Republican colleagues and President Trump to walk back from the brink. Because what we don't want is a national tit-for-tat descending spiral of partisanship. We don't want that. I don't think anyone wants that. I certainly don't. And so my hope is that all of this pressure from the public, from blue states, all of it catalyzed by our quorum break, will put enough pressure on Republican politicians to do the right thing and walk us back from the edge.
Can you envision a day when people might actually return to something called regular order?
I do. I think that, history is a pendulum. And I do think 10 years of this Trumpian politics, this politics as blood sport, this where it feels more like professional wrestling than civic discourse. I do think people are getting tired of that. I think they see through it. I think they're ready for sincerity and honesty and hope again. I do think those traits are going to make a comeback. At least I hope so.
Texas State Representative James Tellerico, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me again.